Hi, I'm Robin Bramley. I'm the joint CTO at Ixxus, and today I'm going to be talking about scalability. And as we're at Alfresco Summit, I thought it quite appropriate to have a mountain theme. So this is, if you don't recognize it, it's Mount Everest. It's one of the big 8,000 meter peaks. In fact, it's the tallest peak on the planet. And, you know, scaling, when you get to talk about really large volumes of content, is a challenge, just like climbing Mount Everest. But also, like climbing Mount Everest with the right resources, equipment, and team is something that can be achieved. And a quick word from our sponsors. So Ixxus are a global Alfresco partner. And, you know, we've been working with Alfresco since version 0.6 back in 2005. And you know, last night we were awarded the Best Solution Partner at the Partner Awards. And one of my colleagues also wrote the Alfresco 3 Business Solutions book. And then sort of about me, before I got involved with content management, I'd worked on a number of different projects covering things like data. I was an architect on an interest rate swaps trading platform. And that taught me, you know, the value of asynchronous messaging and being able to offload and defer work. And I've also had architect positions on some award-winning projects. So Virgin Money Giving is a not-for-profit that was built around the basis of everyone's better off. So they decided that existing charity donation sites were making too much profit, and that should be money that's going to the charity. So there we built, you know, a large service-oriented architecture, and Aon was my first document management project just over a decade ago, and it was kind of revolutionary for their business because they had customers with, you know, hundreds of $1 million reinsurance contracts, so things like the James Bond films, all the moon launches, yet the contracts were signed by insurance brokers over a 3-hour lunch with a couple of bottles of wine. So it was a handwritten contract. They would get to the end, you know, almost all the way through the reinsurance period, and no one would know what was covered. So, you know, we built them sort of XML template clauses, an application so that they could easily work with the content, structure it into a contract, and at the end put it out into Word so that they could print it and sort of top and tail it. And that was all persisted into FileNet using enterprise integration patterns. So that was really kind of, we managed to violations plug in, or part of the violations plug into Hudson and Jenkins. And of course Alfresco, having worked with it for over 8 years, I've done numerous bug fixes, and one of the early ones was things like multi-home NIC support for CIFs very early on. And I've presented at various conferences and had my ramblings published in various places. Now on to sort of really the topic at hand. So I wanted to set the scene by talking about the landscape and keeping with kind of the Everest theme. So here's Mount Everest, bang in the middle. And what you have is you have the plains sort of rising, and then the foothills, and then the mountains of the Himalaya range. And this is quite analogous to what's happening with the growth of content. So, you know, there are various studies about how IBM reckoned that in 2012, 2.5 quintillion, so that's 1 million trillion bytes of data are created every day. And other studies say that, you know, 90% of the world's content has been created in the last 2 years, or that the rate of content was, you know, doubling in size every 2 years, but then that dropped to 72 hours in 2010. And, you know, that's a staggering amount of data that is being created. And some of it is obviously noise, you know, things like Facebook's status updates, okay. Whereas, you know, what we're going to talk about is big content. And you can take the sort of classic V's of big data. So there's volume, and this is the amount of content that you need to handle. And as an example, one of our customers has through strategies that we'll talk about later, but they sort of keep about a high watermark of 100 million objects in their repository. You then have velocity, and a different customer gets on peak, sort of a peak day, about 300,000 new documents into Alfresco every day, and their weekly average is about 1 million. And you then got the variability, and one of our financial services customer is regulated, and for compliance reasons they have to retain all their customer correspondence for 7 years. And just the text messages alone they send 60,000 of those every day, and with their customer growth projections, just the SMSs alone are going to hit sort of somewhere between 3 and 5 billion over 7 years, and that's just one form of their content. It happens to be quite a small form. In fact, the metadata wrapped around it is actually larger than the SMS message itself. But then they have things like call recordings, emails inbound, outbound, scans for the mailroom. Then, when it comes to content, you also have value. Now, all content, when it's created, has some form of intrinsic value, but some items of content lose their value over time. So things like a checklist for a project, it's quite important that whilst you're launching, you go through all the different stages, and that's important content at that time. But after a while, that loses its value, whereas other content increases in value or historical value over time. And one of our customers, Dorling Kindersley, is a big publisher, and they have travel products. And so a lot of these travel products talk about prices, opening hours, but if you are able to look back over a large corpus, you can actually start to do interesting things with that content and pull together new products. So things like the way things were in London. Oh wow, a pint of beer was only £3 back in 2005. And lastly, with content, you have versions. And this is one thing that I find that a lot of customers underestimate the impact of when you have versioning of content. It doesn't take long before a document that has 20 revisions and is a 5 meg document, that soon adds up in terms of space. But also the other impact there is when you look at the explosion of metadata in the database. And kind of the last point on the landscape is to look at some of the Alfresco benchmarks. And I'm not quite sure how legible it is in here. So in 2006, Alfresco 1.4 was benchmarked to 10 million objects. So, 10 little file blobs there. And they published kind of response time figures of less than 0.6 of a second. And this was obviously based on Alfresco Explorers, it predates Share. And this was run on commodity hardware. It was pretty modest, 4 cores, 12 gig, and it had a throughput of 64 documents a second. Okay, that was this kind of the baseline. The following year, it was a bit of a land grab. So on 2.2, running on enterprise-grade Unisys hardware, they went for the 100 million benchmark. So, 10 times the amount. We know that the average size of the document was 50K, and it was pretty impressive hardware. So very fast clock speeds, reasonable amount of RAM, quite a few cores, and because it's all running in the same cabinet, they've got an impressive 140 documents a second throughput. Then there was a lot of talk about the billion object benchmark, and that was one of the things that was talked about for a while and then kind of slowly dropped off. And last year, the Alfresco V4 took a different approach. So rather than going for a land grab on size of the repository, it was more of a real world how you scale Alfresco. And this time the top end was based around 10 million documents, but with a lot of concurrent users. So we had 1,080 concurrent users. The throughput was to get to the fully loaded repository. It was 72 documents a second. But it was a significantly bigger set of commodity hardware again. And that's sort of 48 cores worth, plus the offloaded Solar. So you're actually talking quite a complicated, and as you know, it was a complex architecture. And you know, with all the talk about smart and simple, you know, this was definitely on the smarter end of the scale. Now, underlying every application is a set of resources, and you know, here we see mountaineering equipment for sale in a bazaar in Nepal, and you know, you can quite happily climb up Everest with a second-hand set of gaiters, but are they going to be as waterproof as a new pair? And in some ways, this is kind of analogous to know what you're running something on, and with a lot of people looking at things like AWS, if you know the Virginia, the US East region, some of that's quite old hardware, which is why it's cheaper. So you may not necessarily get as good a performance as if you know you're in one of the other regions or on hardware that you control. So whether that's you know, physical or virtualized. And if we drill in a bit, so anyone who did computer science probably recognizes the von Neumann architecture diagram. So who remembers this from their degree course? That's a reasonable smattering. So the essence, and this is essentially what underpins you know, any computer in this day and age. You have a control unit, some working memory, the ability to get input and output from the processor, and you know, the stored program architecture hasn't changed much. A lot of the advances up until 5-6 years ago, it was mainly in clock speed. So there was this ever ramping up, you know, clock speeds were doubling every 18 months to 2 years, and then in accordance with Moore's law, there was kind of this wall, and you've seen that clock speeds have effectively slowed down, or you know, it's not really increased. And if back on the benchmark slide, the enterprise grade hardware that Unisys were using had 3.33 gigahertz speed, whereas the newer commodity benchmark last year was a mix of kind of 2.66 gigahertz for the Alfresco nodes, but 2.93 gigahertz on the index nodes. But the kind of the revolution has come in the miniaturization. So instead, you now have multiple cores. But what's that done in effect is actually, it means you've got several of these processors within one chip, but they're all still competing for the same input and output bandwidth, memory. And it's kind of shifted the problem a bit. And really, to be able to take advantage of that, you need to have good control of essentially the multi-threading. And I mean, let's talk about some of the bottlenecks in Alfresco. And here we see a gully, and there's another climber waiting to get up that gully because it's not that wide. I could have had a photo of the gents' toilets just after the keynote session instead, but that would have been a bit weird and not with the analogy. Alfresco at its heart has three key elements. You know, we've got the content files, the search indices, and then kind of the relational database that holds the metadata and the kind of the tree structure and access control lists. And you know, obviously Alfresco's architecture is built around a relational database, and its roots from kind of the mid-2000s. That was the kind of de facto way of doing things. And you know, really, they made a smart choice at the time, which was to put an object relational mapping layer in, and that meant they weren't dictating the choice of relational database that their customers had to use. Because you know, large corporates, they have their standards. You know, they either run Oracle, they run SQL Server, and they have DBA skills within those. But that kind of ORM layer introduces another problem in that it's a lowest common denominator. You can't really optimize the queries to any great extent that are hitting the database, and DBAs don't have the full control to be able to tune that database as they'd like. But there are kind of other issues as well. So when people talk about networks and graphs, they often use the kind of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. So the theory goes something like this, is that Kevin Bacon is an actor, he's worked in lots of movies. Within a few hops, you can get to pretty much everyone who's ever acted in a movie. There's actually a site called the Oracle of Bacon, and they prove that there are some people who are 9 degrees away. But we're going to take a small graph, and this is a 2-degree graph. So we've got Kevin Bacon in orange, and then the movies. So first-degree movies that Kevin's acted in are in dark blue, and then there are some other movies that are in light blue, and the other actors and actresses are in green. So we can see that, you know, we can hop via Bill Murray to Charlie's Angels to Cameron Diaz. So Diaz is 2 degrees away from Kevin Bacon. If we put that into a relational view of the world, you know, how would you model it? You'd say we've got a movie, so again, you know, the blue box up the top, we've got an actor, and then we've got this join table that effectively provides us kind of the edges. So an actor who has appeared in many movies, and a movie has many actors, and that's how you resolve the many-to-many. And then you kind of have this dog's dinner of a query that says, well, actually, how can we do these 2 degrees? And, you know, so we've got 3 different actors, Kevin, A and B, 2 movies in between, and then all these link tables, and, you know, just, it doesn't really scale. Obviously, databases like Oracle have, you know, specific non-standard syntax to do things like connect by prior, but the tree walking stuff is a bit of a nightmare. And that was a kind of a nice way of saying that the path queries in Alfresco are slightly painful, and Alfresco's heart has a content tree, and a lot of these queries use Lucene or Solr, but Solr is eventually consistent. And with 4.2, there's, you know, the introduction of a transactional metadata query, and this uses the database. It adds lots of new indices in there to try and help speed up some of these things, but it provides support for a lot of CMIS syntax apart from the in tree, and that's because of that fundamental reason of the dog's dinner queries that just don't really scale very well by the time you remove the duplicates from them. And the other areas of, you know, the repository, the content files, there are obviously different ways of backing the files off, so you don't necessarily, when you cluster, you store them on shared storage, you can push them into, you know, other forms of enterprise-grade storage. And the search indices, now that they can be offloaded, that's quite useful, but again, it's something where you have to ensure it's got very fast disk to it, so it's quick enough. But there are other things that can cause bottlenecks because they're all fighting for the same set of resources on the chip. So I couldn't resist kind of going slightly abstract with the transformation one. I didn't have time to draw a nice picture, so, you know, luckily my warm-up act has a website called Wikipedia that some of you may have heard of. And, you know, here we've got a voltage transformer, but the act of transforming is quite intensive in Alfresco, and every time you ingest a new piece of content, there are a number of transformations that take place. So first off, there's a plain text transformation that you use for indexing. Okay, that's great. We can offload that with the Alfresco index server. And then there are the renditions, so things like the thumbnail for the document library or the preview for the document details page. And again, you know, Alfresco have the Alfresco transformation server offering that can offload some of those. And metadata extraction is another ingestion time process that can be quite heavyweight. So some of the image files, if you're uploading large TIFFs, TIFFs actually get processed twice within Tika. So they do one pass to try and get EXIF out, and then another pass for XMP, if I remember correctly off the top of my head. And again, it's all processing a file. It's all I/O that isn't user-facing. It's back-end activity. But there are also some other culprits. So, audit. In a lot of cases, audit's quite critical, but some of the Alfresco performance tuning zero-day advice is to turn off audit. And when you've got a really busy repository, the activity stream can also, we've had some customer issues with the activity stream. And then in terms of protocols, Alfresco is fantastic. You can connect to it in so many different ways, but not all of those protocols are well behaved, and they don't support pagination. So they're trying to pull back everything in a folder at once. And there's kind of a rule of thumb that there's sort of 1,000 to 2,000 items in a folder is a sensible limit. But it's not all bad news. And I'm going to look at some different strategies for scaling. And this is a painting of some of the different routes up Everest. And it's quite nice in some ways because scaling's an art, but you also, I'm not going to say it's not a science because you actually need to have a scientific way of knowing whether you've made things better. But before we get into some of those strategies, you need to know what you're scaling for. And if the business can't tell you what they're, how they need to use the system, then you really need to start probing those questions. And that's something that can be a bit tricky if it's more of a greenfield project, whereas if you're doing a replacement, then at least you've got some metrics that you can gather for how the system's used, both in terms of content, but also those concurrent users. And to make it slightly easier to remember, I'm going to use redact as a mnemonic. So the R is for resources. One way of, the sort of classic way of scaling is kind of throw resources at the problem. So the vertical scaling is increasing the amount of resources available within a server. And with kind of virtual servers, that's often slightly easier until you hit the kind of high water limit of the host server. So you can increase, the number of CPUs, the amount of memory. But also in resources, you can look at scaling out horizontally. So we can add nodes into a cluster. And one of the new things on the roadmap is actually being able to dynamically do that. So without having to have downtime whilst you bring in a new cluster member, bring it up and now sort of auto-detect it. But not everything can linearly scale out because there is coordination overhead. So moving on to the E, it's kind of really efficiency. So there's a tuning fork. So you have tuning is one thing, and optimization. And this is really where, if you're doing tuning, it needs to be scientific. You need to know what effect of the changes you are making, but also do it one change at a time so you can see whether it has measurable impact. But also you need to repeat everything. You need to repeat your measurement several times to ensure it's statistically viable. And there are a number of areas where you can tune. So the database, does it have enough memory that it can cache efficiently? Are the connection pools sized right? Are you starving the application of access to the database, or is the database actually locking too much? So how can you reduce those locks? Are the timeouts wrong, etc. But also the dry principle comes in. Don't repeat yourself, or rather look at ways that you can put caching in so that unnecessary queries don't traverse all the way down through that stack. The next strategy is really kind of a divide and conquer. So what can you break up? And it comes back to, it's a shared set of resources. So if you're running Alfresco on a single server, okay, which you shouldn't do for availability purposes, but everything is happening on that same box. All those back-end actions are interfering with the user front-end actions. So when they think the response time's slow, it's probably because one of their colleagues has just uploaded a 100 meg Excel file that is nailing the processor whilst it's trying to transform it. So look at ways that the problem space can be split up. So Alfresco have the index server, so you can offload the indexing and search work from the server to another server. There's the transformation server, but you can also shift things like share onto its own separate tier, and maybe a web server tier in front of that, and caching, reverse proxies, etc. But that strays away from the realm of simple there. So what other strategies are there? There's tidy up, and this is a hard one for the squirrel tendency of, oh well, storage is cheap, right, great, we can just store everything. But by doing that, you're actually making a lot more work for the system. At its heart, Alfresco in the database has a couple of very hot tables. So there's Alf node, and this is where every node in the system has its record. But then there's node properties, and if you start to have complex content models with lots of aspects, you can start to see easily a 10 to 100 times factor of size in that table. So I've seen systems with 2 million nodes of content, but over 150 million rows in that node properties table. And in some ways, this comes back to recognizing the value of the content. If it's content that no longer has value, why keep it cluttering the system up? And one of our customers I mentioned earlier, they retain content for a year. So that was sort of 1 million a week, and on average. So by only keeping it for a year, we keep the repository size sort of somewhere in the sort of 60, 70 million content nodes. But then there's also think differently. So the impossible triangle. It turns out there's a sculpture in Perth in Australia, and if you look at it at the right angle, it makes a perfect impossible triangle. But when you see it, it's from other angles, there's a big gap between them. And on the kind of mountain analogy theme, a Swiss climber called Uli Steck recently challenged conventional wisdom, and he did a solo ascent of Annapurna in the Himalayas without oxygen. So rather than a big siege assault of an 8,000 meter peak, he just went for it. No ropes, no oxygen, and he just did it. So can you tackle your own challenge in a different way? And a lot of people come from a traditional viewpoint, so it's like, this is how we do things, this is how you scale. But technology has advanced in other ways. So you now see on AWS they have instances that have lots of GPUs, so graphics processing units, and GPUs are good at certain classes of problems, so matrix maths, vectors, but also, do you actually need transactional consistency or synchronous responses for everything you do? Where can you defer work, defer those commitments without impacting the user experience? And there are other technologies, like obviously the new raft of NoSQL technologies or graph databases that are actually good at other problem domains. And there are some sort of interesting talks coming up over the next couple of days. So there's a lightning talk that I'm quite interested in going to see, where it's talking about Alfresco and Neo4j, and it's been one of the things I'd love to have done over the past few years, is actually look at replacing the DB node service import with a graph database, so something that understands that tree structure. But when you lift the covers under the node service, it's a bit of a leaky abstraction, because the DB ID is rippled up onto the interface, and underneath the covers, it's just the 3 main collaborator classes. There's over 10,000 lines of code, so there's quite a lot to get your head around. And we get involved in quite a lot of global Alfresco projects, and they fall into a couple of different camps. So there's ones where they're quite happy to work in a silo, but then the more challenging and interesting projects actually involve people collaborating from different regions around the world. And when a sort of a beam of light hits a prism, it turns into a rainbow. And this isn't an NSA reference on data gathering, but it's more a note on physics. And the enemy of globally distributed systems is the speed of light. There are some fallacies of distributed computing. So, 2 pertinent ones are that bandwidth is infinite and latency is 0. But that's not the case. And particularly in corporate WANs, even those with kind of WAN optimizers or kind of alternative protocols. So one of our customers uses a proprietary protocol for distributing large files around the world. But rather than using TCP/IP, they use a product called Aspera FASP. But again, you've still got latency and bandwidth to contend with. And one of the things where we find a lot of people are moving to is the cloud. And there are certain challenges, not only with migrating to the cloud, but scaling the cloud. And obviously there's the Alfresco hybrid cloud model. And a lot of solutions that I'm involved in are generally quite complex. And so we have extensive content models, behaviors, and again, that's another area where you have to be careful of how you handle your resources and not making long-running transactions. But there's the hybrid cloud model is interesting for certain classes of document management problems, but at present that API is a limiting factor for a lot of these projects. So we mainly see on cloud and on premise, and not much of that 60% in the middle for the kind of the high-end custom content solutions. And cloud technology is impacting data centers on premise as well as kind of the smaller end of people who are the cloud only 20%. But a lot of our customers are looking at their private cloud, and one of the more interesting areas of technology is the cloud object storage. So when you're looking globally, it is around trying to have sort of reducing that battle with physics. So how can you challenge latency? And some of the more interesting object storage can be quite intelligent. So you can have location awareness of content, distribute it around the world. But again, you end up with these patterns of how do you make this usable from, one of our customers has an office in Tanzania, and they create a large amount of video content, yet it has to go back to the UK for collaboration. And there's this intelligent object storage as part of essentially it's what underpins a lot of cloud storage. So Amazon have S3, There are other open source offerings like OpenStack Swift, and then proprietary ones such as Coringo Castor. And you can actually, with Swift, they now introduce global clusters. Again, it doesn't necessarily fit with some of the patterns that we see. Whereas you have this locality of, we need everything within our firewall on premise, but we also need it for collaboration, for speeding up further around the globe. And those really are make for an interesting change in kind of some of the innards of Alfresco. So for one customer where we were first pioneering it, we added the notion of a future node. So that's basically a node that doesn't yet have its content, but its content is coming. So you've got this, using the asynchronously, send the content in the background, but also by modeling projects and where their collaborators are based, we can also preemptively distribute the content to its collaborators. So, this notion of where does it sync and where's it created, and if it's created close to the center, everything's happy and hunky-dory, and but it is, again, it's fighting physics. And kind of the next thing that we see with the cloud is, where does your scalability go when you're looking at the current Alfresco 1? You bring it up on AWS, you sort of surface nodes across availability zones. There are additional challenges within creating something that's highly available and reliable. And this is actually my boss. So this is the Ixxus CEO back in September, and he's at the summit of Manaslu in Nepal. And really, kind of the essence of that photo is that you can reach your goals. You need to know what you're aiming for. You need to go about it in the right way, with the right resources, the right equipment, and the right team. And with sort of preparation and perseverance, you can get there. And really one of the sort of, combining some of those strategies we've seen, the way we address some of the really large, big content projects is, particularly where it's retention based, is actually through compromising. What are the non-functional requirements that we have to adhere to, and where can we compromise so that we can actually achieve that scalability? And some of the larger projects, we've been adopting kind of the work in progress pattern. So within Alfresco, we keep the content that is live and being collaborated on, so that it can participate in workflows, and then once it's essentially a tidy up job. We put it out to a long-term archive, and that's based around object storage, but we have the ability to discover that content. So it can be found, reused, repurposed, derived. It's not lost, but it's not managed by Alfresco anymore, because that's some of the compromise that we needed to take to be able to actually handle billions of objects. And one of our customers, DK, a publisher, their object storage is sized to hit greater than petabyte. It's kind of easily scalable based on OpenStack Swift. So that work in progress pattern is kind of an application of that tidy up strategy. The things that are interesting, and we classify all the different content as part of falling into different content families. So there are the components, and these are the actual content that we would want to reuse. It has high value. There's then things like contributive content, and the things that are of lesser value, we actually put into archive files, and then if we need to, we can, because they work in books, we can create a new edition of a book, and we can rehydrate the old project back into Alfresco, and it will pull, all the associated assets in. But if we're just deriving, you don't really care about those project level assets that weren't important, so they're not available for discovery, and that's kind of one of the ways that we've been tackling that sort of serious scale problem, is by thinking differently. And tidying up. Let's not have, Alfresco has lots of features, but sometimes you don't need all of those features all of the time on all of your content. So that was kind of the essence of that. And that's where I am on Twitter, my own blog, and Ixxus. And if anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So, any questions?
I'll have a shameless plug for those of you that are interested in stealing on Amazon Web Services right next door. And if you have any questions seriously about scaling, you really should ask it. Okay? I'm not kidding. So find them after the session. But still attend mine.
So I've got a question for you. Who considers that they have a big content problem? Apart from Louis.
Not yet, I hope to have it soon.
And for your problem you hope to have soon, where do you need to scale? Is it for users? Is it for volume of content? Both?
Just a second.
I think we have a lot of metadata.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of metadata in the system, and I think that will be a possible bottleneck. And you said that maybe you should drop some old versions and stuff if you don't really use them. So that was one idea I just picked up here.
Yeah.
It's a simple one, but it's tidying up, makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's the database is one of those things that is typically vertically scaled, and you don't find that many people these days who go, right, we'll throw an HP Superdome at the problem. You've got to make it run on commodity hardware, and with that ORM layer, you're kind of your hands are tied in terms of being able to partition that data or come up with sensible partitioning strategy to actually break down the problem. So,
it's also pretty expensive to scale out your database, partitioning and Oracle licensing.
If you're on Oracle, yes.
It's really bad. So it depends on your setup, but usually less data is better.
Yeah. Less data, more content.
Hello, my name is Oscar. I have a question regarding the number of metadata fields that you would recommend that you should define on a custom type. Is there like an upper limit where the database tables are growing too large and thus the performance decreases and so on?
The metadata in Alfresco is essentially based on key value pairs. And, if it's more than 50, that's kind of, why does it need to be that many? One of the other things that we've done is where we've had data that is really important, but not really for the functioning of Alfresco, is we've done something where we've had a sidecar node. So it might be capturing repeating elements. That's hard to do in key values, or sort of XML or highly structured data in a separate node that's associated to that node. So again, it's a divide and conquer thing. One example of that is rights management information for a publisher. It's highly complex data, but the bit that needs to be surfaced in Alfresco is a traffic light. So we keep all the rich information in a separate node, so it's kind of not bagging down node properties.
You talked about having content in Alfresco, which is not really in Alfresco, it's handled in some other way. I just thought about, could it be good to have like sort of markers for content that shouldn't be handled in a regular way, like no search or no transformation kind of markings?
There are some marker aspects for, you can set up content types or not to be indexed. And you can also set, I'm trying to remember, I think it was four, I can't remember which version now. They introduced the ability to have a size cap on when something would be transformed. But the way we typically do it is using an alternative content store implementation. So we can put everything through into kind of a big bucket. But yes, you can use markers. So you could do it so you have a primary content store and a secondary content store, and make use of the content store selector interface based on a marker aspect. There's another one at the front.
Hi, I actually have two questions. The first one is we usually don't see that much problems with the database. It's almost centric to the transformation or whatever's going on inside Alfresco after a document has been uploaded. And we tried telling it not to index it, but it doesn't seem to be an index issue. It's more like a transformation issue. What are the strategies for handling the transformations? Can we ship it off, offload it? Can we split it on multiple servers? Because usually we have the problem right now. We've split out search, the database, share everything running, but we still have one Alfresco installation or the repository running on one server, and we kind of stuck to see how we could cluster it and do some Hazelcast and all the stuff, but we'd really like to see if you could offload some more of the Alfresco repository.
One of the things that we built, and in fact my colleague who was responsible for leading that team's in the room, was that we built our own transformation services, so to do it asynchronously using enterprise integration patterns. So it is possible to offload that. Alfresco also sell a transformation server that runs on a Windows node and uses Office to sort of perform high fidelity transformations for Office documents. But I think it was undocumented, I don't know whether it's documented now, but you can also make that do other transformations as well. So you can offload that.
Okay, cool. I might have a chat with you a bit later about some details. Another thing we've been tingling a bit about at work, we have often the use of, we really want to use Alfresco as a relational database, but it doesn't feel like the right place. One concrete example, we have metadata, a few metadata about 5 million users we need to pour into Alfresco, and just creating a node inside some directory or some folder and placing them there, it doesn't seem right. What would be the way to do that, to make that scale? Because putting 5 million nodes into one folder wouldn't be the right place. Would there be a custom store to implement it like that, or how would we handle that kind of stuff? Or would it be better to simply just say, well, it seems like more of a simple table than ship it off to an external service?
I was about to say that's an interesting one, and in terms of time, I think we're slightly over. So let's pick that one up offline, because okay. I mean, I need to understand whether it makes sense to extend CM person or what kind of data we're talking about. So yeah, let's take that one offline. Okay. Well, thank you very much.